Okay, we are recording and turn on. Okay. Awesome. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Landscape Conversion 101. My name is Michelle Tramp. I am from the city of Hayward. I work in the Public Works Department and I work on water conservation programs and programs with BAWSCA, which is also the other agency sponsoring this. So I'm also joined with Juanita Salisbury, who will be your wonderful instructor today, teaching you all about landscape conversion, creating a drought tolerant and beautiful landscape. So just a few housekeeping items before we start. Next slide will show you just how the Zoom layout will work. Everyone is muted by default. We will take questions in the Q&A box and look in your bottom of your screen. There's like a little Q&A thingy there. You can also raise your hand if you want to ask questions, but we'll save that to the end of the class. We will let people raise their hands if they want to speak and ask questions. Otherwise, you can also type in Q&A questions in that box. Anything I can answer, if you say you have questions about any rebate programs or anything like that, I type in the answer. But if you want something that Juanita can answer later, you can type it in there and she will answer it live. And also this recording is made available later, emailed to you after the class. So about BAWSCA, BAWSCA represents 26 water agencies, water districts, utility companies that all purchase from the San Francisco regional water system. And we represent agencies to provide water to 1.8 million people, over 40,000 businesses and community organizations without Alameda County, Santa Clara, and San Mateo counties. And BAWSCA's goal ultimately is to supply high quality water at a fair price. So the point of all these landscape classes that you might have seen pop up during the year is that because we see that outdoor water use represents the single largest untapped opportunity for water conservation in the Bay Area. And outdoor water use reduction through the use of water efficient plants and innovative techniques can help conserve water and ensure that future water supply can meet the needs of our communities. And in the next slide, as you go through this class and other classes you might be taking in the future through BAWSCA, you might be wondering how you can apply this in your own garden or lawn. Many BAWSCA agency cities, maybe the city you live in, also has rebate programs to help you achieve this. For instance, City of Hayward has their own lawn conversion rebate program, so perfectly in line with this class. So if you're interested in converting your green lawn into a more drought tolerant landscape, we do offer rebate programs through the city. We also offer a rainbow rebate program as well. And also, I don't think it's on here, but there is a compost giveaway in the city of Hayward right now. We're planning them, but the next one is planned October 30th. So if you have any questions about that, you can feel free to ask me and I can give you more information. More rebate programs available through BAWSCA as well, through the RAFIO Smart Irrigation Controller Program, and rain garden rebate programs as well. And more information is available on that website right there. Okay. And yep, that's another website you can go to. I haven't been to that one, but it's, I guess, a more condensed website with all the other rebate programs. And of course, we have WaterWise and South Bay Green Garden resources, more resources that you can check out later if you're more interested in lawn conversion. And with that, I will leave this for you and we will pass it over to Juanita, who will tell you all about lawn conversion.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, so let me switch screens here into the other presentation. Landscape conversion, slideshow from the beginning. Yes. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Today I'm going to talk about Landscape Conversion 101. So this is kind of beginner level for people, and to have some design tips, some techniques, some really in-depth information about plants and biology to really make it all work together in an optimal way so that we're not um, inadvertently doing the wrong thing by trying to do the right thing. So I'm going to help you through that. I am a landscape architect here in California, and I also do have a PhD in biopsychology, in which I studied eating and drinking. So my emphasis is now at looking at the food chain out in the environment. And I also have a Facebook and Instagram social media presence, so you can follow me at the Primrose Way Pollinator Garden. I often post scientific articles and links to resources on our Facebook page, and I do post a lot of great photographs that I take myself, like this one on this current slide, on the social media. And I also have a YouTube channel, Primrose Way, in which I show a couple of different techniques in terms of like potting things up, seed starting, and seed collecting. So I do take care of 5 public pollinator gardens here in Palo Alto that we started in 2016. We have the Primrose Way Pollinator Garden. This is on Embarcadero Road here in Palo Alto. Primrose Way was our beginning garden. And then we have the Island Drive Garden, Arcadia Place Garden, Hopkins Avenue, and Gwenda Street Pollinator Gardens. And then we're connecting 2 of these gardens on the strip between the street and the sidewalk, and that'll be our Embarcadero Road Pollinator Quarter project. We have native plants planted in these areas. If you're interested to see what these plants look like out there and in use in a variety of situations, feel free to visit the gardens. Most of the plants are labeled, and so you can go out, take notes, see what you like, take some photographs, and try it at home. It's pretty easy to do. So today I'm going to talk about function-based design. So it's always good to think about design first, make a plan, see what it is that you want to do. Talk a little bit about some of the definitions of these terms, talk about the benefits of these gardens, how to do measurement and placement of gardens, some real in-depth information about planting, and then in-depth information about maintenance. Okay, so as a designer, and really any plan that you do, you want to consider form following function. How are you going to use the area? Well, think of the function. What is it that you're doing in this area? So list the function of the spaces that you want. This is your wish list. And this is how I work with clients when I'm doing a plan. But if you're doing your own plan, be your own designer. Think about your wish list. How are you going to organize your spaces? Think about your outdoor spaces as rooms with hallways, walls, which can be fences, floors, which is of course the ground, and the sky then is your ceiling. And then, so with your wish list, do what we call this bubble diagram, and see how your spaces relate to each other. So maybe dining, maybe a barbecue, fire pit, your house, and then with these double-ended arrows, how do these spaces relate to each other? And that gives you a sense of circulation through a space. And it also tells you about movement between areas. And so when you're doing that, think about how function can reduce your irrigation and water use in the landscape. And since we're going to be talking about rain gardens, include that as well, and other landscape spaces. So in terms of function, really reconsider if you're going to install a pool or not, or removing an existing pool. So this was a client that I actually helped remove a pool from. Pools really suck up a lot of water, and especially a pool like this without a cover, a lot of water evaporates from it. But in the end, we removed the pool, and which really tripled the client's usable space. Now this area has a lot of function, uses just a fraction of what water was used before. And now the homeowners can get out there, they can get in here and lounge, they can use their fire pit, they can dine, they can barbecue, all those functions with a lot more elbow space. Before they were just crammed back into a tiny area. Okay, next slide. So again, you want to really leverage this function-based decision-making on optimizing your outdoor water use. And we know that outdoor irrigation uses up a lot of the home's water use. Almost a little bit over half of a home's water use can actually go to outdoor irrigation. And lawns can really use a lot of water, depending on the grass species. Native grass species aren't as bad as some non-native grasses, but grasses can use up to about 50% of outdoor water use, even if they're only about 20% of an irrigated area. So they're really water hungry. And, what does a lawn really function for? In here we have, a picture showing people on a patio. That's where everybody's congregated around fire pits with drinks in their hands. And there's one child running around on the lawn. So if you just want an area that people can walk on, do you really need lawn? If you need something soft, you can mulch an area. On top of the mulch, you can put outdoor rugs or use different plants that use less water. Okay, so note where the people are congregating. All right, pop to the next slide. So again, if your function here with a lawn, this is just one alternative, is to have a green swath of coverage, maybe not with people walking on it. Here's a great plant, just one example of one of our many California native plants that we have, is a Cnocus Horizontalis. Its variety is called Yankee Point. It's evergreen, which means it stays green all year long. About 15 inches tall, so it stays nice and low, spreads out, has these beautiful fragrant blue blossoms. You can plant it in the sun or part shade, and super low water use, maybe irrigating once during the summer, once a month, that is, during the summertime. So really, again, super low water use, gives the same effect as lawn without maintenance. You don't have to mow it. You don't have to irrigate it as often. You don't have to aerate it or fertilize it. So super low maintenance. So this is going to save you money in terms of maintenance, in terms of water. Just a big money saver right there. So, but let's talk about rain gardens too. And this is the definition portion. We're all looking for ways to get water back into the environment, because that's really the best practices for water, is to kind of keep it in the environment and keep from losing it necessarily. And a rain garden is an area that receives water from rooftops or other outdoor surfaces. And they're not intended to store it particularly, but provide an area so it can soak into the soil and recharge those underground water areas. And this here is one in Palo Alto. This is at the Lucy Stern Center, where you have water running off the parking lot into a swale in between, which is planted up. So those plants can then use the moisture in the soil. So again, keeping it in the environment. Some of the benefits of a rain garden is water will soak into the ground, and then it's filtered by the soil and soil organisms, and it's cleaned that way. And so you have nice clean water recharging the aquifers. It keeps pollutants that are in surface areas that are on the streets perhaps, or driveways, out of storm drains. And you can recharge those underground aquifers, which are a great source of water for other things. And if they're designed and installed really well, become really attractive features in a residential landscape that provides opportunities to enhance biodiversity, making the environment better. And also less water is used to irrigate these areas. So then again, you save money by installing these gardens. And a rain garden can be a great way to start converting your own yard to native plants. If you say, well, I don't know how, or consider starting with a rain garden. It's a great way to get some structure in the garden that you can then build on. And this is actually a native plant garden / rain garden that was done by Grassroots Ecology at 1 Alma Street in Menlo Park. So you can check that out on Google Maps, go take a visit and see what that looks like out there in the environment. Lots of great examples. So where does water flow out in the environment? And, you know, a lot of people aren't really aware of what infrastructure we have, the stuff that takes care of liquid flowing. So we have two different infrastructure units to think about. We have the sanitary sewer here on the left, and this is really effluent from toilets, dishwashers, showers, bathtub sinks, washing machines, hot tubs, and so forth. And that flows to our treatment facilities to get cleaned. So that removes all the nasty stuff before that water is then released to the bay. And then on the right, we have storm drains. Okay, these two are separate. They do not interact with each other under the best conditions. Under some terrible things, maybe water flows in, or you have effluent from the sanitary sewer coming out. We try to avoid that. But the storm drains, water is not treated in these storm drains. This flows directly to the bay. So we want to keep pollutants that are on the surfaces like the streets, sidewalks, driveways, and so forth from getting into a storm drain, because that water is not treated. And so any sort of pollutants then are going straight out into the bay, which we don't want because that's harmful to wildlife. So rain gardens can help keep those pollutants out of the storm drains. So when you're doing a rain garden, consider where it's going. And here's a handy checklist. And later this video will be available, so you can go back and maybe take a screenshot of this checklist. But you want a minimum distance of about 10 feet from building foundations. The deepest part, you want a minimum of 5 feet from property lines or from a public sidewalk. You don't want to have your water flowing onto the sidewalk or your neighbor's property. In full sun, if possible, and outside a tree canopy to avoid those large tree roots. You want to avoid underground utilities, and you can actually get your utilities marked out for free by calling 811 before you dig. And you always want to do this before you do any sort of landscape installation. You don't want to dig into your water line, your gas line, or any sort of underground electric utilities. Utilities people will come out for free to mark these for you. You also don't want to site your rain garden on top of a septic tank or a leach field or any sort of other underground structures. And if you can have an overflow area, you want to incorporate that downslope of the garden. And you don't want that rain garden to flow directly into a creek or natural waterways. So siting is very important. Relatively flat areas are best. And you also want to check to see if there's any other local codes or regulations that are not included in this checklist. So how large do you want to make this garden? So this was actually one that I did here in my own neighborhood. A rule of thumb in terms of how large to make these is to make them about 20% of the size of the area that is draining into it. And I use overhead satellite maps and parcel maps to create maps showing property lines and things like that. And so once you have a map, you want to mark the locations of those downspouts, show the area that's draining into it. Okay, love that animation there. So to show that area Here, the rain garden is then about 20% of the size. These are the downspouts. These are the areas that are flowing into it. How do you measure a site? Okay, use graph paper. Graph paper is super easy to help you get the actual accurate measurements. So 1 square can equal 1 square foot. In this particular example, I'm showing squares that are about 1/8 of an inch. So you have 1/8 of an inch equaling 1 foot. And you can lay out a measuring tape, and I like to do it along a house. This is a house here showing the walls of the house. And that way you have it nice and sort of parallel to the house, and it makes it nice and straight so you can measure that way. And then I pull another tape in the opposite direction, pulling from the corner of the house and straight out so that it's nice and straight. And these are at 90-degree angles to each other. And then I leave those in place while I'm making my measurements and then taking inventory as to what's there, like edges of the lawn, existing hardscape like patios and walkways, steps, and so forth. I take note of any existing utilities like water meters, gas lines, gas meters, any sort of overhead power lines, electrical outlets that are on the house, hose bibs, all those things, notable features. And then lastly, which way is north? You know, where's the sun coming from? Where's east? Where's west? Okay. So all those things are important, but that's how you can do a base map so that you can measure things, as we call it, to scale. And then once you're done with that, and this is the design portion of my talk, overlay that base map with a translucent tracing paper, and then very functionally, generally show those functional areas like dining, fire pit, planting areas, you know, with those double-ended arrows, transfer those on, showing movement between those areas. So this is how you can start designing. This is how I do it as a designer, what people pay me for, but you can do it yourself. A design tip in terms of if you're looking at composition, how can you make it look super professional, like you had a landscape architect design it? So again, consider relationships between areas. Use arcs and tangents. So an arc with a line coming off of it. Avoid those random curves that I see these all the time. People just kind of scribble in something. You want to avoid those acute angles because those are maintenance nightmares. And then repeat elements to harmonize the composition. That's these are design tricks that secrets that we don't like to reveal, but you can see I've repeated elements like a larger square repeated in smaller square. Oops, let me go back. And things are aligned along axes like this, and arcs and tangents, and then, you know, repeating elements at a smaller scale. Great way to harmonize things so that everything kind of works together. Okay, now we go to the next slide. Once you have that figured out, then remember form follows function. In this particular case, I'm showing like a rectilinear or real angular sort of design with planting areas around the outside, showing trees very generally shown. And then on top of that, another piece of tracing paper goes on top, and you can show areas where shrubs are going to go. So that's in terms of placement, how you figure these things out. And I'm also showing up in the corner there on graph paper. If you have outdoor furniture, you can measure that up as well. That's a 1/4 inch scale paper. And that helps you kind of place things. Like if you were doing it for an interior, you can do it on the outside as well. So you continue to refine these particular areas. Start with your trees first and planting areas, and then work down to shrub masses. That's what a finished concept can look like, very conceptually. Now, for rain gardens, you want to direct water away from the house using something like a splash block, which is what's shown there in the picture. And then a swale, which is a shallow sort of ditch area that directs water away from the building through a channel into a wider, flatter areas. And you can add gravel to that swale to prevent erosion. But these swales should be kind of a gradually sloped areas, maybe a 1/4 inch in a foot, or yes, a 1/4 inch per foot or so to prevent erosion. If you don't want to use a splash block, sometimes you can use underground pipes to take those the water from the downspouts, and then you can have a pop-up to where the water is directed to a larger, flatter basin. Go to the next slide here. So this is an example of just how we did that for a client of mine, where we took an existing planting bed and we took out all the non-native plants, and then we created the very shallow area in here. We lined it with rocks, which you don't have to do, but rocks are a great mulch to keep weeds down. And then we planted up with grasses and violets and a bunch of other native plants. And the shape of this bed took on the shape of the existing bed, and that sort of reinforces the form. Remember, repeating elements can help harmonize a composition. Now, this is not a rock garden. This is an actual rain garden, because the downspouts will actually flow to this area, and then water will gradually soak in, and the plants will get bigger over time and kind of mask the rocks. You won't see them as much, but it adds some visual interest while that's happening. So another thing that we have going on, this is the backyard of that particular client. In general, you want to avoid the tree roots, and so you don't want to do these underneath of a tree necessarily. But this garden underneath redwood trees was raised up on the low side here to meet this patio. So this is actually an area of fill. So this is very, very shallow. And the contractor we were working with excavated very carefully around these redwood tree roots. And this is super shallow. I mean, it's really not that deep. And the trees were in good shape. We worked with an arborist, but we created sort of this swale going down from, there's an outlet up here, going down to a slightly deeper area. Again, the soil was good sandy loam, so lots of good infiltration here. And the trees really seem to love this. Another view of that, when I said it was really shallow, so the outlet is a little drain opening up here, but you can see there's a really gradual slope coming down from the high point to the low point, and it's super shallow. So again, it doesn't look like a ditch. There's no steep sides, which you want to avoid. You want it to look really supernatural. I think this one turned out great with decorative boulders and then smaller and larger cobble for some nice variation. It's also easy to keep clean underneath that redwood. So again, the sides of your swale leading down to the part where the water's getting directed to should be really very gentle slopes. You want to avoid that erosion that can happen. And those decorative boulders and the river cobble really just adds a nice little decorative look to it. Very nice visual interest item out there in the garden. Now, you don't have to put gravel in the bottom of your garden. This is something that people do to avoid erosion or to provide that year-round interest. And at the bottom, you can leave it as soil, and then you can plant it up with things that don't mind being in water for short periods. So things like this particular plant, this is Limus condensatus, a variety called Canyon Prince, one of our native grasses. And you can see just how lush this grass looked. It's nice blue-green color, just kind of gives you that sort of meadow look. And so at the very end of the garden where you have the basin for water infiltration, what they're recommending, the Bay Area Stormwater Management Agency recommends a depth of 6 inches, so not very deep across the bottom. And it's going to be flat and relatively shallow. And big and flat allows the water to have a large area to spread out and soak in. So if you have something smaller and deeper, that could potentially hold water for a longer time, which will potentially invite mosquitoes to come in and lay eggs and come out and bite you, which you don't want. So big and flat, 20% of the area that's draining into it is what you're looking for in terms of sizing and the depth. Some soil considerations for rain gardens. You want to test your soil to see how quickly the water soaks in. You may need to amend it to allow it to soak in more quickly. If it's hanging out, the water's hanging out in a test pit for longer than 24 hours, probably need to work some sand in. And the way that you test it is that you can dig a hole, fill it with water about 3 times to really saturate the soil. Think about if we're having a big rain event, you know, if the soil is super saturated, if it's full of water, how long is it going to take more water to soak in? So fill it up 3 times, that test hole, and then fill it up that 4th time, see how long it takes water to go in, and then amend your soil to help it drain if it needs to. So some pro tips for keeping that water in the soil. Those rocks and boulders, they're not just decorative, but they have a function in the environment. A boulder on top of soil helps water from evaporating out. And this is in my own garden. I do a lot of experiments, and I've got on the left hand, I've got a boulder, a small boulder, in a bed with a plant next to it. And this actually helps hold moisture underneath. And then next to it, about 2 feet away, is another one of these exact same plants without a boulder. And you can see the difference one rock makes in terms of keeping these plants green and happy. So what to plant in these areas? And we have a great online searchable database done by the California Native Plant Society. And this is calscape.org. And this is a searchable database of all of our California native plants. You can find information here, resources where to find plants, any plants that might qualify for rebates. And you can then create a plant palette to use as if you're a painter painting a painting. You can create a palette of plants to plant from. Anything from trees, shrubs, perennials, bulbs, vines, and succulents. So lots to choose from. And here in California, we have 7,990 plants to choose from. And so the California Native Plant Society breaks this down in terms of all plants. You can see these little squares here along the bottom: trees, shrubs, perennials, and so forth. A planting guide, super important resource to look at. Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Sorry. There we go. Planting guide, nurseries, you can create plant lists and so forth. Now, one of my emphases, remember I talked about my PhD in biopsychology where I studied ingestive behavior, eating and drinking. A better question in terms of planting is who to feed. And we know that plant species need pollinators like bees to survive, and that speciation occurs more rapidly with pollinators. What do we mean by speciation? So let's say you have a group of plants and one of those plants has a very slightly different color flower. Okay, it's forming something that's a little bit different from the other plants, and that happens because for these plants that are pollinated by pollinators, you have those pollinators moving the genes around in the environment. They pick up pollen, which is genetic material, and transfer it to another plant. And that happens more rapidly when you have pollinators. Wind pollinated plants that have a lot of pollen that gets blown around doesn't happen so quickly, the speciation. And then, so the pollinators move the genes around, and that helps spread plant species for butterfly and moth larvae. And those plants that provide hosts for those butterfly and moth larvae then transfer the energy in the environment from the sun to other species to use. So what does that tell us? Biological factors are more important considerations for determining what to plant than other things like abiotic factors like climate, geology, and water. So think about function here in terms of what the plants actually are. And in Alameda County, we have 104 species of butterflies and moths native to the county. So another thing to consider is how much water do plants actually use. So if you want to rank your plants by number of species that they feed, as well as water use, these are filters to help you decide. So there's another handy website that people can go to. This is the Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. It's an online searchable database for free, in which you can look at what they call plant factors that tell you how much water they use in relation to turf grass. So what they're doing is they're looking at turf lawn as 100% of water use, and then ranking plants based on a percentage of how much of a lawn's water use they use. And so high water use, 70 to 100% of a lawn, 40 to 60%, 20 to 30%, and 0 to 10%. So from very high to very low in comparison to a lawn. So you can really, you can really squeeze out a lot of water by ranking your plants from high to low and determining what to plant in terms of very low. How do you lay out your plants once you've got your plan and you've got your plant palette? In your planting areas, always try to have some sort of a maintenance path. So I always draw in the paths first. Before I do any plants, you want your structure. Structure is a way to make a garden look finished. And so if you have a pathway for maintenance, that's awesome. So here I'm showing a grid of squares, and each of those squares equals a foot. And then I'm showing very generally a planting plan here, showing plants at their mature diameter. So, and you really want to use this because plants will fill up a space, and then showing how to space the plants. This is very important. So you want to avoid having things growing really quickly together. And this happens to me still, even though I try to use this this technique where we have the circles just barely touching or overlapping just slightly for spacing purposes. You want to start with your large stuff first, place those, your trees, then your shrubs, and then your smaller things. And that just helps you to get the spacing correct and to find out the number of plants to buy. So again, having a plan saves you time, saves you money, because you know exactly what you need. But why California native plants? California is a biodiversity hotspot. We are one of only a few on the planet. And this is what's super cool about California. We have almost 8,000 species of plants here in California, some found nowhere else. The most plant species of any state in the United States. And many of these plant species are drought tolerant. And so why does California have so many different plant species? Two factors here are working. We have one, a lot of different ecosystems, and two, we have almost 1,600 species of native bees here in California, more than any other state in the United States. Remember I said that pollinators spread that to genetic diversity. So we have speciation assisted by pollinators in these different ecosystems. So we have everything from coastal areas to redwood forests to deserts to oak chaparral environments and so on. So we have unique ecosystems and a lot of little winged flying creatures that help us out in terms of speciation. Lots to choose from. Now, function. Remember, it's all about function in terms of how humans use the space, but let's talk about function of plants. Plants are the beginning of everything, and I call this my from photons to protein slide. And this will help you as a designer of your own garden to make sure you're doing it so that plants are able to help the organisms that use the plants to fulfill their life cycles. So energy from the sun comes down to plants, which converts it into energy that other things can then access. That is, insects like caterpillars, butterfly and moth larvae. So they take that plant energy and turn it into protein then for baby birds to eat and other things further up in the ecosystem. And pollinators move that genetic diversity around that allows for a diversity of the other organisms. So it all works together to create biodiversity in the environment. So in terms of function, plants aren't really then, at least to nature's consideration, they're not decorations, they're food. And when you plant native plants in your garden, you will attract native pollinators and other insects, and in turn, birds. Native plants then become these critical parts of sustaining life. And for the most part, insects don't eat just any plants. They're very specific about the chemicals in the plants that they like. Native plants feed native insects. Native insects do not eat non-native plants. So if you want to transform energy from the sun efficiently for other things in the food chain to access, native plants will do that for you. Plants are decorative. To us humans, they're pretty. They have blossoms and fragrance and colors and textures, but they also have this other actual function to nature, which is a really important consideration. Why is it so important? Because these native plants will attract a native pollinators to your garden, as well as other insects. It's best to avoid making your garden an ecological sink or a trap. And I'll talk about what that means. An ecological sink. So imagine something in the environment that attracts organisms, and because of this attraction makes it easier them to be killed through predation or other means. So say you think, okay, we're going to plant some native trees to attract these insects and provide for them. But if they are unable to complete their life cycle for whatever reason, that becomes a sink. So imagine a tree in a parking lot that has no leaves underneath. Maybe butterflies lay their eggs on the tree, the caterpillars form, they drop down to what should have been leaf litter underneath, but instead is asphalt pavement. Okay, so that's a sink. All those insects are coming in and they're not overwintering in leaf litter because it's not there, and they can't go into the ground because of the pavement. So a good idea gone wrong because you don't have an environment that allows these creatures to then complete their life cycle. We want to avoid that. And so you're getting a sense now of the connectivity of these things. And I saw that there was a question pop up. I can stop and take that question. If Michelle, you want to read that to me?
Yeah, it's a great question. As for homes on the peninsula that are located near the hills, brush, and wildland, are there landscaping tips that help make one's property more fire resistant while still maintaining visual appeal?
Right. That is a great question, and that is a big concern with fire issues, which, is a huge issue for our state with everything being dry. So when you have, there are what they consider defensible zones around houses in which firefighters can come in and defend your property. And there are more specific recommendations that fire departments have, and you can read about those at your local, fire agencies will have some recommendations. Whether it's to have clear zones around the house or things that don't burn as quickly, that plants that have a lot of moisture in them and not so many combustible oils, for example. And there are plant lists that show that kind of thing. And that's a very critical design issue. I know that some people, and this is completely an aside, have irrigation systems that will come on and wet everything down if there's a fire. And that's something that people are looking at. Some people actually have these fire retardant systems that come on in case of fire. So there are a lot of different ways to combat fire issues, whether it's through defensible space planting zones or systems that can wet things down or put fire retardants out there. But that's something to consider, and research separately from this seminar, but it's a great question. Okay, so getting back to native gardens. So native plant gardens, the way that native plant gardens work is that they share water with each other, the plants in these gardens. And the more they're sharing water, the less you have to water, because plants are sharing and they're not wasting as much to evaporation and whatnot. So the more plants that you have in a garden, more plants don't necessarily mean more water. And less water doesn't mean less plants necessarily. And so the more that you add plants, the more you build a community of plants and other organisms that support each other. And they share water, nutrients, and information. And when you're doing a garden, you want to start with a minimum of 20 native plant species local to your area. And so in this picture that I have on the right here, you have a tree with a taproot going down into that groundwater, pulling water up, and then sharing that water through lateral surface roots, and then also creating clouds through evapotranspiration, putting water back into the environment and into the atmosphere, which is going to cool and cleanse the air and help with cloud formation. What do I mean by a plant community? This is from the Vegetation Glossary at the California Native Plant Society website. It's a group of plant species living together and linked together by their effects on one another and their responses to the environment that they share. Typically, the plant species that co-occur in a plant community show a definite association or affinity with each other. In other words, they like each other. Plants will grow well together if they are associated with each other naturally in the environment. And so plants then create a stage, a specific framework in different kinds of environments that will attract a certain community of insects. And those also must be taken into consideration when you're deciding what to plant. Your sequence of plant selection, again, start with trees first, fit in as many as possible, then layer in your shrubs. Your shrub layer should compose over 60% of all your plants. And if you focus on those evergreen shrubs that don't lose their leaves, you can keep your garden looking lush and beautiful throughout the dry season, which can be a real challenge to people when things look dry and desiccated in August, September, October, before the rain starts. It becomes quite challenging. But if you get those green plants that stay nice looking, like those Cnocus, it's not so much of a challenge. And in your remaining spaces, fit in grasses, perennials, bulbs, succulents, ground covers, and vines. So the more, the better. And then while you're waiting for those plants to fill in, use some annuals for color, and they also provide great seeds in the seed bank for the next spring. So here's that rain garden that I did for the client, and I sowed in some nice annual seeds just to get some color before the plants got going. Start with your keystone trees. Again, trees, trees, trees. So a keystone plant in the environment is one that forms the backbone of resources in the environment: food, shelter, nesting sites, and they help other plant species to survive. So imagine a stone arch, and in the middle is that one stone, that keystone that holds up everything else. And that's what trees are in the environment. They provide food for dozens or hundreds of caterpillar species, depending on the plant species. So in your environment, provide at least a few of those keystone plants that provide a resilient native plant garden. Remember, keystone species, you can determine what those are by how many other organisms they feed. That's what a keystone species is. And that really holds the garden together. So don't just do one, try it for as many as possible. And then, so there are 15 tree species native to Alameda County, and here I've ranked them according to the number of organisms they feed, with the willow being a top one, and then going on to the oaks. Trees actually help save water. So again, if we're really interested in saving water and reducing how much money we're spending on water and really keeping it in the environment, plant some trees. They absorb it, release it into the air, cooling and cleaning it. As I said, they form half the rain cycle. So we know about clouds forming over oceans and then going over land and dropping the water. That's a half of where the atmospheric water comes from. The other half comes from trees. They improve water quality. They help reduce flooding. So trees, trees, trees. Trees are super important. And we know that clouds form more often over forested areas than non-forested areas. So it's not just pie in the sky, it's actually clouds in the sky when we plant trees. So again, the cooling effects that they do and the carbon dioxide capture, even with those deciduous trees, more than offsets those bare times when they don't have leaves. So offset in terms of the reflection of the sun. So plant trees, message is clear. And then choose your evergreen shrubs. Again, a pro tip here, choose those evergreen shrubs that don't go dormant to keep your yard looking green. And then to get the keystone shrubs first, rank by the number of butterflies and moths that are hosted there. Choose what will fit for your location and your water needs. If you don't see something that you like, expand your search area a little bit more, and then make a choice. But there's so much to choose from. Maintenance. A native garden is actually less maintenance than a non-native garden with a lawn. Basically, what you're wanting to do is mainly keep the weeds at bay. Plant now. Planting season has commenced. We have a great period from about the end of October to late May, when the soil is still cool and moist. And cool soil helps plants establish. Irrigate those plants about once a week to establish, and you want to irrigate deeply, so just outside that root ball, and that will help the roots seek out that water. You don't want to irrigate right on top of the root ball because that can rot out those roots. You want the roots to get growing and then seek out water. Prune sparingly, mostly to control dead material for fire safety. Don't need to fertilize the soil. That doesn't need to happen. Amend sparingly. Mulch to control weeds initially and then help establish plants. And then mulch with leaves. Leaves are ecosystem gold. If you don't like the way that leaves look in your garden, you think it looks a little messy, you can put a thin layer of bark chips on the top and nobody will ever know that you have a layer of leaves, kind of like the ecosystem lasagna. and they get that uniform, nice look of one layer of bark chips. Now, native bees, those pollinators, they nest in about 70% of all of the native pollinators that we have nest underground. And so we want to leave a few areas of bare dirt for them to get in there. And don't use leaf blowers in those planted areas. Remember, a lot of these insects that overwinter as pupa and then turn into butterflies later will overwinter in leaf piles. So when you're blowing leaves out, you're essentially getting rid of your butterflies, and you don't want to do that. If you like butterflies, if you think they're pretty. If you're using a leaf blower to clean off your hardscape, like your patios, your driveways, your walkways, use a broom or use that electrically powered blower, because that way, and there's actually a law coming out now that you can't use gas powered blowers, but if you can reduce those fumes and emissions, you're still helping the environment, because a lot of these insects will use odors to navigate. So we don't want to interfere with that behavior. And then don't use pesticides, herbicides, or fungicides. And again, avoid creating an ecological trap. So you don't want to plant these things and then have all these insects be attracted, but not be able to fulfill their life cycle. Okay, that's not really helping the environment. And if you can connect your environments, that's good, because then you have gene flow between areas. An easy thing to do is to reduce light pollution at night. Okay, I use blackout curtains in all of our windows to reduce light pollution. If you have motion sensor lights, that's good. You don't have to have lights on all the time. You can use motion sensors. If you want lights on at night, use yellow bulbs that don't attract as many insects. Again, leaving the leaves underneath plants is super good. And I eliminate the use of pesticides, herbicides, and fungicides, which can get into the soil and interfere with the hormonal development of butterfly and moth larvae, as well as other insects. And then reduce gasoline fumes as much as possible, because of that orientation that insects are using to find their ways around in the environment. They use odor cues. So some final thoughts. I know it's a lot of information, but I've given you guys some great places to look online for researching what plants to plant, how much water they use, some great design tips. But the more that you understand these ecosystem services that the plants are providing, and how plants can actually save you money on water and maintenance, the more that you see that there are these interrelationships in nature and where your place is and how you can optimize how productive that native plant garden can be. And that will lead to an abundance of life, as well as enhancing your appreciation of that abundance, and also what your role is in caring for nature's complex beauty. And with that, we can head over to those questions. I'm sure that there are a couple.
Yeah, so we do have a question. They ask, would native plants thrive in a raised bed that was created between two retaining walls? The soil depth in the bed is 2 to 3 feet deep, and the bed is approximately 100 feet long by 4 feet wide.
Yes. So native plants are really resilient. They will grow just about anywhere. And so the answer is yes. Depending on what the exposure is like, there are a number of great species to plant in that kind of an area. Sort of my go-to plants are the manzanitas for really starting out. I always try to, first I research what manzanita, the scientific name is Arctostaphylos, is local to the area, and you can search on Calscape to find what plants are local and what will work in that size. So you want to see how big they get, obviously, and go from there. But yes, something will definitely grow in that kind of area.
And the same person asked if they would like to add native plants to their home orchard that has 20 fruit trees, and if you recommend any design for that.
Yes, absolutely. Gosh, there's so many. So when you add native plants that bring in all those pollinators, you can actually enhance the pollination that happens as well in your orchard. Um, and so, especially if you need bumblebees to pollinate things, anything like with a tubular blossom, like like the blueberry variety that we have here called Vaccinium ovatum, or otherwise known as the huckleberry, blooms early, can bring in things. You know, the Arctostaphylos, as manzanitas, they're early, mid, and late bloomers that can bring in bumblebees. Um, and they have a tubular blossom. So those things can be planted as like a hedgerow. If you're looking to plant in between plants or rows of trees, perhaps, you could do a pollinator strip with annual flowers. So there are lots of things that can work well, um, you know, in between trees or between trees, you know, even creating a few pots of annual plants. They will come in, the pollinators will come in and enhance some of the pollination services on your trees, and you might even end up with more fruit set.
Great. And next question asks, how do I tell the slope of my yard or lot? I can't tell the direction the water drains. And if you can change the slope of the yard, like for the house.
Right. So the slope, what you can do to, there are a few ways to determine slope. One is to use a hose and see where the water is going. Um, you know, if you spray water, where's the water trickling to? That's an easy way to know that you have a slope and what direction it's going, and you can change that. So a 2% slope is about a 1/4 inch of drop over 1 foot of length. So that is about the maximum that you want in terms of a slope for drainage purposes. Any steeper than that, the water's going to run faster, which will erode the soil away more quickly. And some people will actually take a string between 2 stakes, and then you can put a level line on it, a little tiny leveler to make sure your string is level, and then look at the beginning of the string and the end of the string, what the difference is in height between the string and the ground. So at one end, the top, at the bottom end, more. So you can see the length of the string, the distance between the ground levels, and then the difference between those two will tell you what your slope is.
Okay. The next question asks, do the free native plant sites also indicate what type of pollinator each plant supports?
What was does the Cowscape say what?
Yeah, I think
Oh,
the site you shared, yeah.
yes. So for each plant, it talks about what species of moths and butterflies will feed upon that plant. Um, and so that butterflies and moths, they are and aren't pollinators per se, because they don't specifically move genetic material around in the same way that bees do. Um, and there's a great resource that was put out by Jeffrey Caldwell, and I think it's available on the California Native Plant Society Santa Clara Valley chapter website, that talks about specifically what plants bees do like. And some bees are very specific about what they like. Some are what they call oligolectic, which means they only feed upon a specific type of plant, because not all pollen, and pollen is what they use to raise their babies on, not all pollen is created equally. Some are very specific to, like, asters, for example, or sunflowers, whereas some are polylectic, which means they will feed on anything. And bumblebees are like that. They will eat just about any type of well, they don't, the adults don't eat the pollen, they give it to their babies. But they will pretty much be generalist gatherers of pollen. They will really get on any type of flower. But yes, so you can look on the CNPS website to see if there's that that publication. But really, if you have about 20 different species minimum of plants that are blossoming, you'll have a really great variety of pollinators coming into the yard. And with those pollinators and other insects, you'll start getting a balance of insects and predators coming in, because really the only vegetarians out there in the environment are the bees. They're drinking nectar and eating, some eat a little bit of pollen for protein, for building things, but basically bees feed their offspring these pollen loaves, but other insects feed their offspring other insects. So it's really a wild kingdom out there in terms of like predator prey. All insects kind of eat each other, and then the lizards eat those, and then the birds eat the lizards. And so you end up with a nice balance between predator prey and insects chewing on things, plants, that is.
Okay. Someone else asked if you have any suggestions to where to buy native plants, and how can you tell if they're healthy when you buy them?
Yeah, so the Calscape site, let's say you go to there and you research an Arctostaphylos species that you want, it's local to your area. They can, for each plant, it tells you what nurseries that plant is available at, and you can click on the links to those nurseries, and then you can go to those nurseries websites and see what's available on their inventory lists, which they do publish. So you can save yourself time and money by not going looking for things, but to see what's available on these sites. And there's a number of native plant nurseries local to our area. My go-to ones that I really like here in Palo Alto, or in the Palo Alto vicinity, I really like going to the Grassroots Ecology Nursery up in the Foothills Park Preserve. They have a lot of nice local species there, fairly cheap. That one's good. There's Yerba Buena Nursery over in Half Moon Bay. And so the way that you can tell that the plants are healthy is if they're growing after you plant them. But if they look like they're not like drying up, or there's sort of a disease on them. But most of these places aren't going to sell you a plant that isn't robust already. Sometimes plants don't look so healthy because they're dormant, and there are a lot of California plants that do go dormant during the summertime. And right now they're just starting to wake up. So certainly that's a consideration, whether you get the ones that go more dormant, which is how they handle the drought here, or whether you're going to go with something that's a little bit more lush looking, maintains a lot of really dense greenery. So you can tell by looking at the plants, and typically when you go to pick up the plants, you can talk to the nursery person there and say, can you give me some tips on this particular species? Is this healthy? Should it look like this? And most of the native plant nursery people are very knowledgeable about the species that they grow and can give you some awesome tips.
Awesome. And the last question we have right now, looks like they're asking about using emergency water, chlorinated water from the storage tank for, I guess, maybe watering.
If you have stored water, and you need to use it, I would say go ahead and use it. We are expecting some more rain coming in tomorrow, yay. I try to use as much rainwater as possible, but for supplemental water during those dry months, when some plants, don't like a lot of summer water, but they do appreciate what we call the rinse off once a month. And some plants can look great after you just spritz them off in the middle of August because they're dusty and nasty looking, and you just want to freshen them up and moisten them up just a little bit without wetting that hot soil, which you want to avoid making hot, wet soil. And so it might be good to save that water for those times. You know, again, it's what are your needs and what are the plant's needs?
Great. And one more question. How often do we need to replenish wood chips? Do you need to worry about introducing pests or diseases when you get free wood chips?
You know, it depends on the type of wood chips. So a finer wood chip mulch will break down more quickly than a more coarse one. And like on our Embarcadero Road Pollinator Corridor project, in a section we put down a nice mulch from Lingso, which is the premium bark mulch. And that's a little bit more finer textured, and that will actually break down more quickly. We'll probably have to put down more of that maybe in another year. And we put down a fairly thick layer of that because that section was with nothing but ivy before we had that removed. But we really wanted to discourage it. Other places like our primrose garden, we initially mulched that pretty heavily with about a foot of mulch back in 2016, which that mulch is gone now. And we won't replenish it, except perhaps in places where people walk along the edges. You know, so it really depends on what your needs are. If the mulch is looking a little thin, you know, you have some opportunities there to let leaf litter accumulate. And I cannot stress the importance of leaving the leaves in the environment. Leaves are ecosystem gold. They perform so many functions in terms of absorbing water like a sponge, and then making that water available to organisms, as well as providing places for insects to hide, because as I mentioned before, all insects are somebody else's meal. And so they're going to hide. If you don't like the way it looks, you know, let's say you put down a nice layer of really decorative mulch and it's, you know, goes away because it's breaking down, other organisms are eating it. And so there's like a chip here and a chip there, but so you have a layer of leaves, you know, put down like 1 chip thick of bark mulch if you like the look of that, how it looks. You know, again, mulch when you feel like it's necessary to mulch. Use leaves whenever possible. The way to avoid bringing in pests or sort of pathogens is to get your mulch from reputable sources, like Lingso, for example. They have a really nice mulch that's, you know, has never given me any issues. So find reputable sources for mulch and kind of go from there. And, you know, I don't know what a disreputable source of mulch might be, but there may be some, but just try to find a good quality mulch, you know, based on commercial success, like a place like Lingso, or, you know, maybe the city I know the city of Palo Alto provides mulch that they grind up from the trees here in town where they may fall over and things like that. So you may not know exactly what you're getting at, but I think with a commercial product, you know more about what actually you're getting. So long answer to a question, but reputable sources.
Mhm. Great. And I guess the person followed up from the previous question about the chlorine in the water. I guess they're worried about should they be worried about extra chlorine on the plants?
Extra pouring water on. So, you know, I think during the rainy season, you know, it's extra water is not such an issue unless they're in standing water and they don't like that. If they're plants that like to be well drained, and they're not in that situation, that they're not going to do well. But during the hot months, if those plants are low water use and don't like to be watered, and this is after they've been established, so that becomes important, an important consideration. You're not going to want to water during the hot times, because that will moisten the soil when it's warm, and warm, wet soil is going to introduce pathogens that will disrupt those nice underground relationships between plant roots. And so spritzing them off so that you're not soaking the soil, even with those low water use plants, they're fine with that, kind of the dust off. But you can maybe, for the plants that are maybe somewhere in the middle, are going to like a little extra water, you know, rather than the very low water use, but outside that root zone, so that, and deeply, so that the roots are actually finding it. Once the plants become more established, and you can tell if they're getting established, if they're growing nice and robustly, if they've kind of doubled or tripled their sizes, then you can start reducing the water needs. And especially if they're connecting roots up with other plants, and that happens quickly underground, then you can start to reduce water use over time.
Great. And again, one more question. This person says, you gave one example of ground cover that can replace lawn space. Can this person look up ground cover options that don't require a lot of water, but can provide that green space on the Calscape website?
So for things that you can walk on, there are native grasses that will work just fine, and use about 1/3 as much water as a regular lawn for walking on. Another one that I like to use that actually spreads by runners is Achillea Milifulium, which is yarrow. And that's a nice sort of leafy, fine leafy textured perennial that has a nice white blossom that we use. And those are a couple that come to mind that you can walk on, that takes some foot traffic. Any sort of thing that spreads by runners underground, that's not really a woody perennial, but is more softer perennial, like maybe a native strawberry that spreads by runners that you can walk on. So you don't want things that have a real woody branch, because that's going to be hard to walk on. So things that are softer, stemmed, you can, it's a foot traffic.
Okay, great. I think that is all the questions that we have. So unless there are any outstanding questions or anything else, I think we can. Oh, I think we have one more. We can maybe look at this one. Again, I think it's the same question that you had before about the chlorine in the water. I think kind of answered that, but do you have any more input on that? But
yeah, you know, watering is something that the California Native Plant Society people will talk your ear off, because it's a huge issue. Everybody's trying to think about the best ways to get moisture to these plants. And actually on the Calscape website, where they have the planting guide, they go into real in-depth information about that. And I would direct people to that part of the page to really read about what their best practices are for that. You know, some people, and you know, with me, it's like, you know, it's like, oh, it seems to be dying, maybe I should give it more water, when it's actually not dying, it's just going dormant. So, you know, there's a lot of kind of understanding the life cycle of these plants and how they look during the year. One of the plants that we have out at the Primrose Garden, which is the Salvia Bee's Bliss, it's a big ground cover. And boy, you know, that plant during August and September looks like it's dried up, doesn't look so good. And it doesn't really respond to irrigation during those times. It's going to go dormant. It's going to look drier. It's not going to look like full of lush water in the leaves, no matter how much water you give it. In fact, it'll probably kill it. So, you know, it's like understanding how those plants look during the year, which is why it's important, I think, to go out and take a look in these gardens to see, and not just once, but go out during the spring, go out during the fall, go out during the summer, take a look, because they don't all look the same, you know, And some of the plants do not respond to irrigation during the summertime. They are going to go dormant, by gum. They're not going to change that for anything. And that's just their life cycle.
Okay, well, if we have any other outstanding questions, we shared our contact information, and feel free to send me a message afterwards. And again, this webinar is recorded and will be emailed out to you later. So thank you again, guys, for joining this webinar for a very important issue. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in future classes. So thank you, Juanita. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Michelle.
Have a great rest of your day.